Hi, Dr. Craig.
Hi.
I'd like to follow up on the previous lady's question. It seemed to me like most of your evidence for proving your 4 facts was predicated on Scripture itself. It seemed like there was very little cross-referencing, as you suggested in your answer to her question. So my question is, why is it that we take the New Testament to be of such validity and
To be what?
to be so valid? Why do we take it to be valid and wait 1 second, and at the same time not fully believe that, say, the stories in the Odyssey occurred in reality, or that other great Greek fictions were also real? What separates the New Testament
Well,
from
in
those?
a sense, the lecture this evening is the answer to your question. The lecture this evening is an explanation of why most scholars today think that the story, for example, of the discovery of the empty tomb is historical, or why Joseph of Arimathea is taken to be the person who buried Jesus. I mean, think of the burial account of Jesus. I am in no way, as I said, privileging the New Testament. We're looking at all of the ancient sources for Jesus, but what we have in the case of the burial is...
What sources support this story besides the New Testament?
Why do you ask that question?
Because
you see,
I
that
feel like...
question betrays the assumption that the sources in the New Testament are somehow suspect and are not to be taken as evidence. But if something's outside the New Testament, now that's real evidence.
Oh, I apologize. I'll clarify.
No, wait, now that's question begging, because what I'm saying is that you look at all of the sources that we have for the life of Jesus equally, and that in the case of the Gospels, these are the earliest and most primitive sources that we have for the life of Jesus. And so to ignore them in favor of extra-biblical sources would be simply mad as historical methodology. The historian always will look at the earliest, most primitive documents as his most reliable documents. And what I tried to show this evening is that these facts are, for example, take the burial, multiply independently attested in early documents. And this is one of the most important criteria that historians use for establishing a fact of ancient history.
Right, which brings me to my question, right? What other sources attest to this
burial story? In the case of the burial account, there's something like 5 different sources, independent sources, some of which are among the earliest of the New Testament. I mentioned 2 in my talk tonight. This pre-Pauline formula that Paul quotes in his first letter to the church in Corinth, Greece, is information that comes from...
Shouldn't the letters from the apostles also be taken with a grain of salt in that case? It just seems to me like the validity, the truth of the resurrection is dependent on the truth of Scripture, and the truth of Scripture is dependent on...
No, you have not shaken loose yourself from the presupposition that this is somehow an inspired document and that you believe in it because it's inspired. That's not the way critical historical Jesus scholars work. And it's not a matter of the fact that Paul says it. As I say, what's critical here is that Paul is quoting from a pre-Pauline tradition that goes back to within the first 5 years after the crucifixion. This is a source which is incredibly close to the original events, which Paul himself used, quotes, and passes on. So it has nothing to do with Paul. He's just the intermediary who passed on this tradition. Similarly with the pre-Mark and Passion story. Mark may have been written in the early 60s, but the pre-Mark and Passion story goes back even earlier than that. Many scholars will date it around AD 40 or so. That's just 10 years after the death of Jesus. Now, you compare that with sources for, say, the life of Alexander the Great, where the earliest sources or earliest biographies we have of Alexander are written by Arrian and Plutarch 400 years after the death of Alexander. And yet they're still regarded by classical historians as largely reliable accounts of his death. The sources that we have for the life of Jesus are just incredibly close to the events that they are about, and therefore they are taken extremely seriously by historians today. And you can't write them off because hundreds of years later, the church collected these documents, put them under one cover, and called it the New Testament, right? I mean, originally there wasn't any such thing as the New Testament. There were just all these separate documents written in the Greek language, like Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, Paul's letter to the church in Thessalonica, Luke's gospel of the life of Jesus, John's gospel of the life of Jesus. All of these various documents were then later collected and put under one cover called the New Testament. And therefore it's just bad historical methodology to say, oh, that's in the New Testament, therefore this isn't an important historical source or isn't a valuable historical source. That's just treating it anachronistically. You've got to treat these documents for what they originally were and then look at or apply the criteria for historicity to the documents with a view toward determining what is reliable in them and what is unreliable and can be ignored or discarded.